In a small-town courtroom, Judge Thomas Benton sat behind his oak desk, scanning through the paperwork in front of him, his expression stern as usual. The room was quiet save for the rustling of papers and the occasional shuffle of feet from the gallery. Today was another busy docket day full of routine hearings for minor violations, parking tickets, speeding fines, and petty misdemeanors. But then a name caught his attention: Cassandra Turner. He glanced at the file. She was listed for a minor traffic violation, a speeding ticket, one of those cases that never really mattered to a judge like him. His eyes skimmed her name again. The name didn't sound familiar at first, but there was something about it that felt significant. Still, he didn't give it much thought as he prepared to call the next case. He had a job to do, and he had done it 1,000 times before. As the court door opened and Cassandra walked in, the atmosphere shifted almost imperceptibly, her presence commanding attention, her appearance sharp in a well-tailored suit, her walk confident, her gaze steady and sure. The crowd seemed to notice her too. The few people present in the gallery shifted in their seats, taking note of this woman who carried herself with the poise of someone far more important than just another person caught speeding. Judge Benton didn't rise to acknowledge her presence. He was too focused on the case at hand. Without looking up, he gestured for her to approach the stand, his mind already calculating the routine fine that would be assessed for a simple traffic violation. He'd assumed this would be just another quick decision in a long line of similar cases. But as Cassandra moved toward the bench, her calm yet assertive presence piqued his curiosity. She wasn't nervous, not at all. Something about her demeanor gave him the impression that she was accustomed to much bigger rooms and far more important matters. Judge Benton gave her a cursory glance as she stood before him and said in his usual gruff tone, "What brings you to my court, Miss Turner?" Cassandra stood firm, her voice even and controlled. "I'm here to take responsibility for the speeding violation," she replied, without hesitation, her eyes meeting his directly and holding his gaze for a moment longer than he expected. A flicker of something passing between them, a subtle defiance, or perhaps it was just confidence. But Benton couldn't shake the feeling that this was not going to be as simple as the other cases he had dealt with today. He quickly looked down at her file, scanning it again, but there was nothing remarkable about it, just a ticket for speeding on a local highway, the officer's report indicating a simple infraction, nothing that warranted special treatment. But still he felt a surge of judgment. Perhaps it was the way she looked at him, perhaps it was the way she stood, or maybe it was something about her that he didn't quite understand. But Judge Benton's words came out before he could think. "I'm going to fine you the maximum amount, Miss Turner," he said, his voice cold and official. Cassandra didn't flinch. She simply nodded her acknowledgement without a word and stepped back as the judge moved on to the next case. Her composure remained unbroken. As the proceedings continued, Benton couldn't help but notice a lingering sense of discomfort. He had made a quick judgment without really seeing the person before him. But what could he have known about her? She was just another defendant, wasn't she? Within hours of the court session, the news of Cassandra Turner's fine spread like wildfire through the small town. The local newspaper picked up the story, highlighting the severe fine handed down by Judge Benton for a minor speeding violation. At first, the incident seemed insignificant, just another day in the courthouse, but the public quickly began to react. Social media erupted in a flurry of posts, memes, and commentary. People started questioning the fairness of the fine, with some insinuating that it was racially motivated. Cassandra, as a black woman, had been singled out for harsher treatment, many believed, and the backlash grew quickly. The media outlets took the story further. The small-town incident, once just a minor court decision, suddenly became a national talking point. A video of Cassandra calmly accepting the fine went viral. Some saw it as a woman wrongly targeted by a biased judge, others as a woman unjustly humiliated. Supporters of Cassandra began to rally behind her, with hashtags like #JusticeForCassandra trending across platforms. People expressed outrage over the fine, some claiming it was disproportionate for a minor violation. They demanded accountability for Judge Benton, calling for an investigation into whether racial prejudice had influenced his decision. Meanwhile, Cassandra remained silent. She avoided the media, keeping her focus solely on her career. As an accomplished lawyer, she had seen her share of injustice in the legal system, But this incident was different. It wasn't just about her. It was a moment that could spark change. She wasn't going to let it be used for personal gain or drama. Her colleagues, however, couldn't remain quiet. Many of them were furious, not only because she had been wronged, but because they knew that this fine was not an isolated event. It was a symptom of a larger problem that plagued the legal system. As the controversy grew, some suggested that Cassandra might want to take legal action against Judge Benton. But she wouldn't engage in that fight. She had bigger goals in mind. The days following the fine were turbulent. The courthouse, usually a place of routine hearings, was now filled with whispers. Judges, lawyers, and clerks discussed the incident in hushed tones. Some of Judge Benton's colleagues were already uneasy about his harsh treatment of Cassandra. A few even quietly expressed their doubts about his judgment, but none were brave enough to speak up publicly. The judicial system, after all, was built on tradition, and questioning a senior judge like Benton wasn't something anyone took lightly. Then, just as the storm was beginning to settle, an unexpected turn of events occurred. The governor's office made an announcement that stunned the legal community and the media. Cassandra Turner, the woman at the center of the controversy, had been nominated for the position of Chief Justice of the state Supreme Court. The news hit like a thunderclap. Her nomination was both groundbreaking and controversial. Cassandra's career had been one of trailblazing achievements, defending clients from marginalized communities, challenging unjust laws, and advocating for reform. But the nomination, especially in the wake of the public incident, stirred debate. Her critics saw it as a political move, a reward for staying silent after the incident. Some questioned her ability to lead the state's highest court after the very public and contentious experience with Judge Benton. They wondered if this fine was a sign of something deeper, an indication that Cassandra, for all her talents, might not be the right person for the job. But Cassandra's supporters rallied. They saw the nomination as a chance for real change, for a new kind of leadership that reflected diversity and fairness. In the midst of the controversy, Cassandra's integrity became her strongest asset. While the media continued to debate her candidacy, she kept her eyes firmly on the prize, her focus unwavering. She had always known that the fight for justice would not be easy, but now it was more urgent than ever. As the days passed, the media frenzy around Cassandra Turner's nomination for Chief Justice only intensified. News outlets across the state, then the nation, became fixated on the woman who had been fined by Judge Benton for a minor traffic violation and now stood at the center of a high-stakes political battle. Her supporters hailed her as a beacon of hope for the legal system, someone who could bring real, lasting change to the judiciary. Detractors, however, argued that her recent public clash with Judge Benton raised serious concerns about her ability to remain impartial in the face of controversy. The backlash was fierce, with many questioning her temperament and ability to lead the state's highest court. Cassandra's nomination, which had initially been seen as a promising step forward for a more inclusive judiciary, had become a flashpoint for the state's deep divisions over race, justice, and power. Her critics, many of whom were entrenched in the old guard of the legal system, painted her as a divisive figure, unqualified for such an important role. They speculated that her nomination was a political move, a token gesture meant to placate activists and progressives. The narrative was carefully shaped to undermine her accomplishments, focusing instead on the public incident with Judge Benton. Despite the public vitriol, Cassandra remained determined. She knew that this moment, this nomination, was more than just about her. It was about the future of the judicial system. She had spent years fighting for justice, not just in courtrooms, but in communities where the system had failed the most vulnerable. She had built her career advocating for marginalized voices, pushing back against ingrained biases, and fighting for equality under the law. To back down now, to let her detractors define her, would be a betrayal of everything she had worked for. While the political climate grew more charged, behind the scenes, some powerful allies were quietly working in her favor. A group of influential legal scholars and reform advocates wrote op-eds, spoke at rallies, and appeared on television to defend her qualifications for the role. They painted Cassandra as a leader who could bring much-needed reform to a system that had long been plagued by corruption, inefficiency, and racial inequality. They highlighted her decades of legal experience, her groundbreaking work on landmark cases, and her commitment to reform. But it wasn't just her supporters who rallied behind her. Cassandra herself became a voice of calm in the storm. She granted interviews where she calmly but forcefully explained her vision for the state's judiciary, emphasizing the importance of fairness, transparency, and accountability. She spoke of the need to address systemic biases within the legal system, to give every individual, regardless of race or background, an equal shot at justice. Her words were measured but powerful, and over time, they began to shift the tide of public opinion. Yet the fight was far from over. The confirmation hearings loomed large on the horizon, and those who opposed her nomination were gearing up for a bitter battle. Cassandra knew that the real test would come when she stood before the Senate, when her critics would have their chance to tear her down. Every speech she made, every word she said would be scrutinized. In the midst of the political storm, Judge Benton's role in the controversy remained a sore point. His actions in court, though made in haste and without full consideration, had now become a focal point for the opposition. It was clear that many believed his harsh treatment of Cassandra had been influenced by her race, and the stain of that incident could not be easily erased. Even though Benton had publicly apologized, some saw it as a mere attempt to salvage his reputation in the wake of mounting pressure. Still, the question lingered. How would Cassandra handle it? Could she move past the humiliation and prove that she was the leader the state needed? With the confirmation hearings approaching, Cassandra knew that the true battle was about to begin, but she was ready. After all, this was not the first fight she had faced, and it wouldn't be the last. She would rise above it, just as she always had. As the days grew closer to the Senate confirmation hearings, the tension in the air was palpable. Cassandra Turner had become the focal point of a political and media firestorm, but it wasn't just the public that she had to contend with. Her biggest challenge now lay in the hands of the very people who would decide her future. The senators, most of whom had never crossed paths with her before, would soon take their seats in the hearing room. The scrutiny she would face from them would be even more intense than anything the media had thrown her way. Judge Benton, who had been the catalyst for the controversy, couldn't escape the growing pressure either. While Cassandra's supporters were rallying behind her, Benton found himself in the crosshairs. The question on everyone's mind wasn't just about Cassandra's qualifications anymore. It was about the fairness of the judiciary as a whole and how deeply ingrained biases shaped its decisions. His involvement in the scandal had made him a central figure in the debate, and now Benton was forced to confront his actions in a way he had never anticipated. Sitting at his desk one morning, Benton found himself staring blankly at the pile of case files before him. His mind kept drifting back to that fateful day in the courtroom when he had handed down the fine to Cassandra. He hadn't meant to overstep. He hadn't meant to create this ripple effect that now threatened to destroy his reputation. But deep down, he knew something had gone terribly wrong. He had misjudged her, and worse, he had failed to see the full scope of who she was. Cassandra Turner wasn't just a woman facing a speeding ticket. She was an attorney who had dedicated her life to fighting for justice in ways that most people would never understand. It wasn't until Benton overheard a conversation among his colleagues in the hall that the weight of his mistake truly hit him. They were talking about Cassandra, but they weren't discussing her recent controversy. They were talking about her career, the cases she had won, her commitment to civil rights, her brilliant legal mind. One of the younger judges mentioned that Cassandra had been nominated for Chief Justice, and Benton's heart sank. He had never realized the depth of her achievements. In his mind, she had been just another lawyer in his courtroom, but now, hearing the admiration in the voices of his peers, Benton felt a profound sense of regret. Suddenly, the fine he had imposed on Cassandra felt like a moment of personal failure. How had he not recognized her for what she truly was? How had he allowed his assumptions about her to cloud his judgment? The guilt weighed heavily on him. He had always prided himself on fairness and impartiality, but now it seemed that the biases he thought he had buried deep inside had surfaced when he least expected it. Late that evening, Benton found himself sitting at his kitchen table, a pen in his hand, drafting a letter. It was the hardest letter he had ever written. He knew he had to apologize, not just to Cassandra, but to the public as well. He had to make it right. He needed to acknowledge the harm he had caused, not just to her career, but to the very idea of justice. The next morning, Benton made the decision. He would issue a public apology, not for his own sake, but for Cassandra, for the fairness of the judiciary, and for himself. The road ahead was uncertain, but Benton knew one thing for sure. He had to be part of the solution, not part of the problem. The apology would be his first step toward redemption, toward making amends for a mistake that, in a small town, could echo far beyond a single courtroom. But as he prepared to make his public statement, Benton also realized something else. This apology, though important, would not be enough to erase the stain of his actions. It was clear now that the conversation about race, bias, and justice was far from over. Judge Thomas Benton knew that the moment had arrived. His public apology was imminent, and it would be the first step toward righting his wrongs. But as he prepared for the press conference, the weight of the decision felt heavier with each passing minute. He had always prided himself on being a man of integrity, but now he was forced to confront the ugly reality that his actions had been tainted by unconscious bias. The more he thought about it, the clearer it became that this wasn't just about a simple mistake. It was about a larger system of injustice that he had unknowingly contributed to, and it was a reckoning he wasn't sure he was ready for. When the day of the press conference arrived, Benton stepped into the spotlight, his heart pounding. Reporters filled the room, their cameras trained on him, and the air seemed thick with anticipation. The world was watching, waiting to see how he would address the controversy that had shaken not just his career, but the trust people had placed in the judiciary. Cassandra Turner's supporters were eager for an apology, while her detractors were ready to see if the judge would admit to a mistake or continue to defend his actions. As Benton took the microphone, his mind briefly flashed back to the day of the hearing. He could still see Cassandra standing before him, calm, poised, and resolute, while he had let his personal biases get the better of him. He couldn't shake the feeling that he had judged her unfairly, not based on her actions, but on an assumption he had made about who she was. That was the painful truth he now had to face. "I stand before you today to offer an apology," Benton began, his voice steady but filled with an underlying tension. "I made a mistake. In my courtroom, I failed to see a woman who had worked tirelessly her entire career for justice, and instead, I saw something based on my own assumptions and biases. I misjudged you, Miss Turner, and for that, I am truly sorry." The reporters shifted in their seats, scribbling notes. The room suddenly silent except for the sound of Benton's words. He continued, each sentence heavier than the last. "I want to acknowledge that my actions have caused harm, not only to Cassandra Turner, but to the trust the public places in me as a judge. I failed to uphold the very principles of fairness and impartiality that I swore to uphold when I took this position. I was wrong, and I deeply regret the impact of my decision." As Benton finished speaking, there was a pause. The room seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the next move. For a moment, Benton wondered if the apology would be enough, if it would truly be accepted. He knew that words, no matter how sincere, were not enough to undo the damage done. His acknowledgement of the mistake was only the beginning of a much longer road to redemption. In the days that followed, reactions to Benton's apology were mixed. Some viewed it as a courageous and necessary step, while others were less convinced. They argued that his apology, while public, was little more than a calculated response to the pressure mounting on him. Regardless of the skepticism, one thing was certain. Judge Benton's admission of guilt forced a larger conversation about race, bias, and accountability within the judiciary. For Cassandra, the apology was important, but it was not the focal point of her fight. She had heard Benton's words, and she recognized their significance, but she was not one to allow a single moment of contrition to define her journey. The true test would come in the days and months to follow, when Benton would need to prove, through actions, that his apology was not just an empty gesture. Cassandra was focused now on her next battle, the Senate confirmation hearing. It was time to prove to the world that she was more than just a woman caught in a scandal. She was ready to show that she had the strength, the vision, and the resolve to lead the state's highest court. No matter the roadblocks ahead, no matter the doubts cast upon her, Cassandra Turner would rise. And when she did, she would make sure that the justice she fought for would no longer be limited by the biases of those who were supposed to uphold it. The Senate confirmation hearings were scheduled, and Cassandra Turner stood at the precipice of her life's defining moment. For weeks, she had been the subject of intense media scrutiny and public debate, but now she was about to step into the room where the future of her career would be decided. Her nerves were steady, though the weight of the moment pressed on her chest like a heavy stone. This wasn't just about her anymore. It was about the future of the judicial system itself, about breaking barriers and dismantling the biases that had long been entrenched in the courts. She knew that the confirmation hearing would be her opportunity to demonstrate the very qualities that had made her a formidable force in the legal world: intelligence, poise, and unshakable resolve. The room was packed with senators, cameras, and reporters. Cassandra had prepared for every question that might come her way, though she was well aware that the true test would be handling the difficult ones, the ones designed not just to evaluate her qualifications, but to undermine her credibility and challenge her character. As she walked into the hearing room, her eyes briefly met those of her supporters sitting in the back, and for a split second, a rush of gratitude and determination washed over her. She was here to fight not only for herself, but for everyone who had been silenced by an unjust system. Senator George Bennett, the head of the Judiciary Committee and a well-known critic of Cassandra's nomination, was the first to speak. "Miss Turner," he began, his voice calculated and stern, "you have been nominated for one of the highest positions in our state. You've made a name for yourself as an advocate for civil rights, but there's one question on the minds of many. How can you, as a nominee for Chief Justice, be trusted to be impartial after the very public incident with Judge Benton? Your clash in the courtroom, followed by your silence in the face of a blatant injustice, raises serious concerns about your ability to lead." The room fell quiet, every eye fixed on Cassandra as she prepared to respond. She had anticipated this line of questioning. Senator Bennett's words were meant to bait her, to draw attention to the controversy that had surrounded her name in the wake of her speeding ticket fine. But Cassandra didn't flinch. Instead, she stood tall, her voice calm and measured. "Senator Bennett, I do not seek to justify the actions of anyone in that courtroom. Not mine, not Judge Benton's," she began, her eyes unwavering. "But I will say this. What happened between Judge Benton and me was a moment. A mistake on both sides, yes, but a mistake that does not define who I am or what I stand for. I am here today because I've dedicated my life to fairness, to equality, and to creating a system where justice is not swayed by who you are or where you come from. I am not defined by one incident. I am defined by the body of my work and the values that guide me." A murmur rippled through the room as Cassandra's words hung in the air. Some senators nodded, others remained skeptical, but it was clear that she had struck a chord. Furthermore, she continued, "I believe that in order to move forward, we must confront the imperfections in our system. If I'm confirmed as Chief Justice, I will lead with integrity, but I will also lead with the understanding that our legal system is not perfect. It is flawed, and it is my job to ensure that we make it better for everyone. For the marginalized, for those who have been unheard, and yes, for those who might have felt forgotten by the system." The room was still, the weight of her words settling on the crowd. Senators exchanged glances, and some even leaned in, clearly impressed. Cassandra knew this was just the beginning. There would be more questions, more challenges to her character and her qualifications. But in that moment, she had set the tone for what was to come. This wasn't going to be a fight just for her position. This was a fight for the future of justice itself. As the questioning continued, Cassandra answered every query with the same grace and composure, offering thoughtful responses that reflected her years of legal experience and her deep commitment to justice. The skepticism from some of the senators persisted, but Cassandra had come prepared. The questions grew sharper, but so did her resolve. She knew that the fight would not be easy, and it wouldn't end with this hearing. But she was determined. This was only the beginning. Her journey, the path she had taken, was far from over. But one thing was clear. Cassandra Turner would not back down. The fight for justice, for equality, was her life's work, and she would stop at nothing to ensure that the next generation would see a world where the law was truly fair for everyone. The days following Cassandra Turner's Senate confirmation hearing were filled with a mixture of tension and anticipation. The hearings had gone better than anyone could have expected. Her calm, decisive answers had impressed many of the senators, even those who had initially been skeptical of her nomination. However, there were still those who remained unconvinced. They questioned whether her career, while admirable, had truly prepared her for the complexities of the Chief Justice position. The media's focus shifted from her previous clash with Judge Benton to her qualifications, her legal philosophy, and the political implications of her appointment. The debate intensified, with supporters rallying around her and opponents continuing to scrutinize every aspect of her background. Cassandra's life, which had once been largely focused on the law and her advocacy for reform, had now been thrust into the political spotlight. Everywhere she went, she was recognized. Strangers would approach her with words of encouragement or criticism. Her phone rang constantly, with reporters and politicians alike seeking her comments. The pressure was immense, but Cassandra remained resolute. She had always known that any path she chose would not be easy, especially in a system where so many barriers existed for people like her. In the weeks leading up to the final vote, Cassandra spent her time preparing for what was ahead. She met with legal scholars, thought leaders, and activists, seeking their counsel on how best to approach the challenges of leading the state's highest court. She worked tirelessly to refine her legal philosophy, focusing on how she could bring lasting reform to the system. Every day, she re-examined her values and principles, ensuring that her commitment to fairness and justice would not waver under the weight of public opinion. One afternoon, Cassandra received an unexpected phone call. It was from her mother, who had been following the confirmation process closely. "I've been thinking about everything you've been going through," her mother said softly, "and I just want to remind you of one thing. You're not doing this for yourself. You're doing it for everyone who's been silenced, for every person who's been pushed to the margins. And I know deep down you're going to change the system. You've always believed in justice, and I've watched you fight for it your whole life. Don't let anyone make you doubt that." Her mother's words gave Cassandra a renewed sense of clarity. The fight wasn't just about her, though it often felt like the weight of the world was on her shoulders. It was about creating a better future for everyone, about ensuring that the law would truly serve all people equally, regardless of their race, gender, or socioeconomic background. The day of the final Senate vote arrived, and the atmosphere at the state capitol was electric. Cassandra was poised but nervous. She stood with her allies, many of whom had supported her from the beginning. Outside, protesters gathered, both in support of her nomination and against it. Some waved signs that read "Justice for All," while others questioned whether someone like Cassandra could lead a court that had traditionally been dominated by older white men. The voices from both sides were loud, but Cassandra kept her focus. As the senators filed into the chamber and took their seats, she felt a surge of determination. She knew the road had been long, and she knew that, no matter the outcome, this fight would not end here. She had already accomplished so much simply by making it this far. The vote began, each senator rising to cast their ballot. The tension in the room was palpable. Cassandra's heart raced as she watched the process unfold. One by one, the votes were tallied, and the numbers began to sway in her favor. It became clear that her supporters in the Senate were beginning to outweigh the opposition. And then, after what felt like an eternity, the final vote was announced. Cassandra Turner had been confirmed as the Chief Justice of the state Supreme Court. The room erupted in applause. Some of her supporters cheered loudly, while others, including a few senators who had initially questioned her, exchanged glances of acknowledgement. Cassandra stood in silence for a moment, her emotions a mixture of relief, disbelief, and immense pride. She had done it. As she made her way out of the chamber, the weight of the moment finally hit her. She had fought through bias, prejudice, and countless obstacles to get here. But now, as the first black woman to hold the position of Chief Justice, Cassandra Turner knew that her work was just beginning. The true test would come when she took her seat at the head of the court, when the real challenges of leadership would begin. But she was ready. For Cassandra, this was only the first chapter of a long and difficult journey toward justice, and she would not stop until she had transformed the system from the inside out. The first day Cassandra Turner walked into the Supreme Court as the Chief Justice, the weight of history and responsibility settled on her shoulders. She had fought for this position for years, navigating systemic barriers, challenging ingrained prejudices, and surviving public scrutiny. But now, in the heart of the state's judicial system, Cassandra knew that the real challenge had just begun. This wasn't just about securing a title. This was about fundamentally reshaping the way justice was served. As she entered the courtroom, the other justices rose in respectful acknowledgement. Cassandra had earned their respect, but she knew the work ahead wouldn't be easy. The legal system had long been dominated by tradition, and many of her colleagues were entrenched in old ways of thinking. Some were reluctant to embrace the kind of reforms she was eager to implement, but Cassandra's resolve remained unwavering. She wasn't just there to represent her own views. She was there to bring about real change, to ensure that every person, regardless of race, gender, or background, had equal access to justice. Her first few months on the bench were marked by both progress and resistance. Cassandra took time to meet individually with the other justices, listening to their concerns and finding ways to bridge the gaps between them. She knew that the court couldn't change overnight, but she also understood that a single voice could make a difference. She worked tirelessly to advocate for new initiatives, proposals for reforming sentencing guidelines, creating more accessible pathways for underrepresented communities to access legal support, and prioritizing the reduction of racial disparities within the prison system. But it was the smaller moments, the conversations behind closed doors, where Cassandra's leadership truly began to shine. One afternoon, during a discussion about a particularly controversial case, a fellow justice challenged her views on racial bias in the legal system. The man was an older, seasoned judge, known for his traditionalist approach. He argued that bias, while acknowledged, was not the root cause of many systemic issues in the courtroom. Cassandra listened patiently, her eyes unwavering. "With all due respect, sir," she began, her voice steady but strong, "bias isn't just something that happens in an isolated moment. It's in the system, in the procedures, in the way cases are prosecuted or defended. It's in the way we choose who to prosecute and how we decide who gets leniency. If we ignore it, we're perpetuating it." The conversation continued for hours, and by the end of the day, the justice, though still skeptical, acknowledged the validity of Cassandra's argument. It was small victories like this one that slowly began to chip away at the resistance. Cassandra wasn't looking for quick fixes. She understood that true change took time. But with each day, each decision, she was building the foundation for a new era in the state's legal system. Cassandra's efforts didn't go unnoticed. As she pushed forward with her reforms, she gained the respect of even her harshest critics. One day, as she was leaving the courtroom, Judge Benton, who had once fined her in that fateful traffic stop, approached her. His face was solemn, but there was a look of recognition in his eyes. "I owe you an apology, Miss Turner," he said, his voice tinged with regret. "When I first met you, I made assumptions about you that were wrong. I didn't see you for who you truly were, a brilliant attorney, a leader, and someone who could change the system for the better. I've been watching your work, and I can see now what you're trying to accomplish. I was wrong." Cassandra nodded, accepting the apology without hesitation. She didn't need validation from those who had tried to undermine her. But hearing it from Benton, someone who had once been her opponent, was a reminder of how far she had come. She was no longer just fighting for herself or against those who doubted her. She was now in a position to shape the very system that had once marginalized her. As the months passed, Cassandra's influence on the court grew. Cases that had once seemed hopeless were revisited with fresh perspectives, and her colleagues began to trust her judgment. In time, she became not just a Chief Justice, but a symbol of what the judiciary could be, a place where fairness and equality weren't just ideals, but lived realities. Cassandra Turner had broken barriers not just through her position, but through her actions. She had risen above the challenges that sought to hold her down and transformed the state's highest court into a place where justice was no longer just a concept, but a promise fulfilled for everyone. Her journey, though only beginning, had already shown that change was possible, even in the face of a broken system.